All right, so this video is going to take you through the first part of the American Revolution. That's the part where things start out. So if you're looking at the 5 stages of rebellion, we're going to take a look at stage 1. That's going to be the beginning, what starts things. And then into stage 2, how things start to accelerate. And we kind of take a look at this through the lens that the British will eventually be the bad guys in this story. They even admit that. However, they're not really the bad guys at first, and you'll see why with this video. And then as we continue the story with future lessons and videos, you'll see how it progresses and England really does turn abusive. But it wasn't that way to start off. The way this whole thing starts is with a debt. In 1763, there was a war known as the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War. Called that because it lasted around 7 years, 1756 to 1763. Now, this is a really big war when it comes to Canadian history, but in American history, it's important because it gives way to the start of how things will fall apart between the American colonies and with England. The reason why this war matters is it's the end, the conclusion of a decade, or actually almost a century-long series of wars that took place between the French, their native allies, and they both fought against the British. And the big thing that we're fighting about was land. The land here in yellow, I'll show you on the screen where I'm talking about here, right there in yellow, all this stuff was disputed out here. Both England and France claimed this land. Now, this was the British colonies, but even parts of this up here, France wanted some of this land as well, and they were fighting for it decade after decade into the 1700s. So the war takes place, and England wins. Now, what you need to know about this war is how England won, because it wasn't easy for them. They were really unprepared as far as fighting a war against the natives who fought in a completely different style, and it was territory the British weren't as familiar with as the natives were or the French. So the first couple of years of the war didn't go very well for England at all. And what they had to do was to put together the biggest number of military troops they had ever put together before up to this point. It was their biggest land army ever. And they sent it over to America to win this war by sheer size. And they did it. It took them 7 years to do it, but they ended up defeating France and winning this war. And what that meant, you look at this map right there to the right, all that stuff in yellow became English land. All the things that were disputed between England and France, England now owned all of it. All France kept were some fishing rights up in Newfoundland, which is right up at the top upper right-hand side, the northeast of the map. And you can see down the Caribbean a little bit of an island called Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti. That's all they got to keep. This is a really important thing for the Americans because now France is no longer a threat to them. France was a threat living right next door, but now France has been kicked off the country. They have been kicked out of America. They're no longer a threat to the colonists in the 13 colonies. And the other thing, too, is all this land up there in yellow on the map, that's land that the American colonists were going to probably move on to. What that meant was the victory England achieved over France and their native allies really benefited the people living in the British colonies here in America much more than it benefited the British people living back in England. So because of that, England wanted the American colonists who benefited from this victory to help pay off the debt. Not the entire debt. But when you fight for 7 years, it's really expensive, and England had this huge debt from the war, and they said, America, we need you to help us pay off this debt. After all, you got a bunch of new land, and France is no longer a threat to you. But Americans didn't want to do it. There were 2 reasons why. Reason number 1, the new land that they were going to move out on, at first the British forbid them to move on to it. The reason why was that the French may have surrendered, but the native tribes hadn't. They continued to fight. And the reason why they continued to fight is that they figured that if the Americans moved out into their territory, it was going to be just like it was in the East Coast when more English colonists moved in, and it meant that the native tribes started to see themselves overwhelmed, and the more settlers moved in, the more problems there were. Now, the natives weren't wiped out, but they certainly had their power weakened and lessened. And the tribes out in the frontier, and I'll show you what I mean by that, all out in here, they were the ones who did not want to stop fighting because they feared that if they did, they too would be overwhelmed eventually. So they kept fighting like Chief Pontiac did. You see his picture over there on the left. Pontiac's out near Detroit, Michigan. It's out in this area. That's where they're fighting. He's part of the Ottawa tribe right out in there. And because they're still fighting, the British realize the more people who went out there, they're going to get attacked. If American settlers, if British colonists went out there, the war would just continue. And that meant that the British military would have to protect these settlers, and that meant more war and more debt. So what the British did was draw a line, and you see it right there in red. It's called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And that line simply banned American colonists temporarily from moving west past the line. The idea was from England, until we can kind of get the situation settled with these natives who continue to fight, we don't want you getting attacked and killed, and we don't want to continue a war which would just add to the debt we already have. So this line, you're not allowed to cross this, at least for now. Later on, we'll evaluate it, but right now it's just not safe. The Americans had a problem with that because they wanted to move on to the new land. And the second problem was the way England wanted to pay off some of that debt. Now, this isn't bad, but Americans weren't used to being told what to do by the British. For almost 100 years, England had practiced a policy called salutary neglect, which was kind of letting the colonies run themselves. Each one of the colonies, like Massachusetts, let's say, they all had their own governments that the people there elected. They had an assembly or a Congress. They had a governor that was either picked by the king or an elected person. Either way, though, the people had a government that they had some say in. At least men had some say in it. They were the ones who were allowed to vote. And as long as things were working with a trade relationship between the colonies and England, England mostly left them alone. That's what salutary neglect is, just kind of out of sight, out of mind. The thing about that, though, is that England is still in charge. But since they were so far away, American colonists started to get the wrong idea and kind of felt that they were in charge and England no longer had control over them. So when England decides they need the Americans to help pay off that war debt, they pass a very small tax on sugar known as the Sugar Act. It's going to tax things like sugar, molasses, other products. A lot of those products are used to make rum, for example, which was a big trade good. So it was a big product. They figured if we put a small tax, a 2-penny tax on sugar, this will pay off the debt pretty quickly, and Americans will barely notice it because it's a pretty small tax. And it's just an import tax, which was common then and now. So it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a huge tax. It was a small little thing. But Americans, again, weren't used to being given demands or even rules by the British, so they resisted this, and they didn't like it. And their response was smuggling. The Sugar Act probably would have paid off the debt, or at least a big chunk of it, if they could have done it for a few years. But American colonists refused to pay for it. And they started to smuggle sugar in. And Maine's a big smuggling place for this as well in the Northeast, because our coastline, especially in southern Maine, well, everywhere really, but southern Maine was closer to the trade port of Boston. There were so many areas where you had coves and nooks and crannies of coastline where you can kind of sneak in, unload your ship, and take it by land down to Boston and avoid paying that tax. Excuse me a second, I'm going to cough here. You didn't hear it because I turned down the microphone, but that was the reason for the pause. So yeah, they wanted to basically pay off the debt, and the Americans were smuggling. And the British were appalled by this. They couldn't believe it. One, we just won a war that benefited you colonists. And two, all we're asking for is a little help through a small tax, and you're going to break the law to get around it? That's what you're going to do? They felt it was really ungrateful and appalling Americans would just break the law and smuggle. So, to stop smuggling, England wanted to police the ships, and they created what was known as writs of assistance. They're a lot like search warrants today in America, but not exactly. The British military used these writs of assistance to board ships and search them and make sure that what was on that ship matched the cargo list, and they weren't hiding anything to smuggle in, especially sugar. But they weren't like our search warrants in America here today, and here's why. In white, you see what a search warrant today is. Police have to get a search warrant by bringing evidence to a judge and say, here's the reason we need to search somebody. This is the evidence we have that we think makes it believable, probable even, that a crime's been committed. The judge will decide if police have enough evidence for what's called reasonable cause. Is there a reasonable belief to think we need to search here? If not, the police cannot search your property without it. Now, there's a couple of exceptions to this, things called probable cause and permission of owner. We'll talk more about that, actually, when we talk about rights later on. But the point being is police can't write their own warrants. A judge has to give them permission to search, and a judge won't do that unless you present him or her with evidence, real evidence that says we need to search property. It's not, oh, I just feel like searching this person's property today. You need evidence in America today to do that. But those British writs of assistance we have up there in yellow were different. One, there was no judge involved. The British Navy, who acted like police in this situation, they wrote these warrants themselves. They didn't need any evidence at all. They could search for whatever reason they wanted to. There had to be no reason at all given to the ship owners why a search is taking place. Basically, they search everybody like they were criminals to try to stop smuggling. And it's okay to stop smuggling, but you shouldn't treat people like criminals unless there's evidence that they are breaking the law. And that's the problem. And people have rights of privacy and property. They don't want people going through their stuff. If police have a reason and a judge gives them a warrant, okay. But the British started to violate rights when they started to search ships without permission, nor evidence, nor warrant, and just treated everybody like criminals. The idea was good. They needed to stop smuggling. But the way they went about it was the wrong way, as it violated the rights of privacy and property of American ship owners. So, the Sugar Act didn't work. Americans smuggled. It didn't make much money. It would have if people paid it, but it didn't, so the debt was still there. So England went to Plan B, called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is a tax on all printed items, and everything was printed back then. Newspapers, marriage licenses, cards, even dice. And it was called the Stamp Act because what you did was you went to the store, you picked up something that was paper, you brought it up to the clerk at the store, you went to pay for it, let's say it was $1, the clerk would say, that's $1.05, please. And you'd give them the extra 5 cents, and they would take a stamp, and they would press that stamp onto your purchase, and that was your proof you paid the tax. It's kind of like the sales tax today that we have in the state of Maine. If you buy something here and it costs $1, you need to have $1.05 when you pay for it. Same reason. It's a sales tax. The only difference is they don't stamp anything. They just basically take your money and you go after paying that tax. And the British decided to use the Stamp Act because everything was paper back then. There was so much paper for communications. They figured it would be impossible for people to smuggle around it, and Americans couldn't avoid it, and therefore it would pay off the debt. And they were right about that. Sort of. It did cause problems. And Americans hate this more than the Sugar Act. And the reason why, it's a direct tax. Meaning, unlike the Sugar Act, which was paid for by the people who were merchants who brought the ships into the country, whoever owned the ship paid the tax. This tax comes directly out of the pockets of every American buying paper, kind of like sales tax today. It's a direct tax. It goes directly, the money does, from you to the government, and you know full well you're paying it. Now, American colonists, they were not new to direct taxes. They'd paid direct taxes before, but the difference is they used to pay those to their government in the colony, where they had a voice and they could vote for people there. In this case, they're paying money to England and their parliament 3,000 miles away across the ocean. And in England's parliament, which is the word for their Congress, their lawmaking group, Americans had no voice. There were no Americans there, just British people from England. And the Americans said, that's unfair. If you're going to take our money, we need to have a voice of people who live here with us and understand our problems and understand what life is like here, because if you don't understand that, you really can't represent us. And they were right about that. The thing is, too, the British had nothing to lose by giving Americans a voice. That parliament, that Congress that made laws, there are several hundred people there. If you give the colonists one voice for every 13 colonies, 13 total voices, those 13 can't come in and outvote 300 people. So England had nothing to lose power-wise by giving them a voice, but they decided they didn't want to do it. And that Americans didn't need a voice because Parliament already spoke for them, even though it was 3,000 miles away. And that's what this slide says. Basically, that the English believed that they were represented, etc. And because there was no representation, you started to have a major part of every rebellion's second phase, the acceleration part, rebel groups form. One of those groups is the Sons of Liberty. Sam Adams, one of the More famous members of the Sons of Liberty is pictured right there. Now, this is a group that was a lot like the PLC during our game of Catalan and Democ. They were violent and used violent methods. Vandalism, threats, intimidation, beatings, tarring and feathering. And if you haven't seen that yet, depending on when you're watching this video, I will certainly be showing that to you in class and kind of what that was like a dramatization. It's not pleasant. It's pretty brutal, actually. They were a brutal group. And they used forceful and violent methods to fight the Stamp Act, including beating people up who were doing their job by collecting it. Now, they didn't kill anybody, much like the PLC didn't either. But that threat, those threats, that intimidation factor, England was outraged by this. You can't do this in a free country and just bully people. And they also were upset that Americans were once again refusing to pay off the debt, especially in Boston, Massachusetts, where most of the incidents we're going to see in our story take place. There was another group called the Daughters of Liberty, too. A woman named Mercy Otis Warren was one of the leading members here, and they were the women's group. The Stamp Act, it was hard to smuggle around it. The only way you could do it was by shoplifting something that was paper, and then you're hurting the store owner, which you really didn't want to hurt. So they had to find another strategy to hurt England financially. The idea was, let's boycott British goods. A boycott is when you simply refuse to buy something. But for a boycott to work, it has to last a long time, and many people have to do it, and you have to replace those things you're boycotting if you need them. An example I use in class all the time. If Halldale students decided they were going to boycott the cafeteria for whatever reason, if they only boycotted it for a day, it's not going to really make much difference. Everyone's back tomorrow. But if you boycotted it, say, for a couple of months and started costing the cafeteria money, whatever your complaint was, they'd probably have to listen and try to meet you at least halfway. But the thing is, you're still going to get hungry right around lunchtime. So if you don't find a way to replace your meal here at school, now that you're not buying cafeteria food, eventually you'll give in and start eating and the boycott falls apart. So you have to replace the things you're refusing to buy, the things you're boycotting. And that's where these women, the Daughters of Liberty, came in. First, they planned the boycotts and organized them and got lots of people in Boston to refuse to buy British goods. Now, that was a lot of stuff because England imported a lot of things to us. The way it worked is that we gave them raw materials like lumber, let's say, and cotton and things like that, and that got shipped to England. And in England's factories, they turned them into finished products, like cloth, if we're talking about cotton here. And they sent it back to us, and we bought the finished products, and we made things out of them. Clothes, for example. Well, clothes are a need. You really can't do too well without them. So what the Daughters of Liberty did was find ways not just to boycott, but to replace those important products that Americans were no longer buying from England. That's why, for example, people in the Northeast, up in Boston and Massachusetts, start making their clothes out of wool. They're taught how to shear sheep by these Daughters of Liberty and other farmers, and that becomes the product. We don't need to buy British cloth anymore because we're using American wool, and that made the boycott last longer and longer and longer. And this starts to really infuriate Parliament and King George III. He's the guy in charge, King George III, although England's Parliament had a lot of control, more than he did, in fact, but he is kind of the number one individual, so he gets most of the blame. And it wasn't just that Americans were disobeying the law that was making Parliament and the king mad. It was the fact that this boycott was causing them to lose money. The idea of the Stamp Act was to make money and pay off the debt. And the opposite happens. They're now losing money. The Stamp Act is costing them a lot. And the debt is not only not getting paid off, it's slowly even getting bigger again. Which meant the king and Parliament knew they had to do something to get rid of that Stamp Act. And they also do something else to get Americans to obey paying paying off the debt and paying those taxes and stop breaking the law or protesting. But King George has got to find a way to do this without looking weak, because if he just backs down, he's going to look really, really weak, like a pushover, and that the Americans kind of forced him to change his mind. And kings don't like to look weak. So he had to find a way to get out of the Stamp Act and cancel it without looking weak. And right here is a shift with England where they start to become more focused on making Americans obey and respect England's authority than actually trying to solve the problem in a way that benefits everybody. And that'll be an issue. So that's the end of this video. The next one I call the British play hardball. They're really going to start to try to force Americans into compliance, into obeying everything they say, and that becomes their primary concern. And Americans, the more they're told to obey, the more they're going to push back. That's the subject of the next video, and we'll see more acceleration and see how this problem gets worse and worse and worse, even though right now it could easily be solved. If England would just give Americans 13 voices and have representation of these American colonies in England's parliament, the whole thing might have ended. Americans still would have complained about taxes, everyone does. But at least they couldn't complain they didn't have a voice, and that was the big complaint. Without a voice, they felt correctly that their rights were being violated, and this fight with England is going to be all about rights. And we'll see how England violate more of them when we move on to the next one next time, and they get very consumed with forcing Americans to obey. So that's coming up next. We'll be going over some of this stuff in class, or if you haven't been there. We will be talking about this, and you can certainly ask me questions anytime you want to if stuff in the video is unclear or raise curiosities.